If you've wondered how wild horses cope with the cold and harsh winter this year, and if you want to know what flying over the range in a very small plane was like, this episode is for you. Welcome to episode 4 of Freedom for Wild Horses. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. This year has been the longest, harshest winter I can remember in Wyoming since I started going in 2004. The locals say it's been the worst winter since 1982-83. The last time I visited the wild horses in the Red Desert Complex was the end of November. There was very little snow on the ground, but that all changed in December. Snowstorm after snowstorm swept in and buried the area. And the Arctic fronts that moved in brought record chills to the area, making it impossible for the snow to melt. The normal roads I used to access the area stopped being plowed and could barely be seen under snow cover. No vehicles could go in. To say that I was concerned about the wild horses and the other wildlife in the area is putting it mildly. The Red Desert Complex consists of 753,000 acres, and the herd management areas in it are Green Mountain, Crooks Mountain, Antelope Hills, Stewart Creek, and Lost Creek. These are all herd management areas managed for wild horses. But the largest area of them all, Arapahoe Creek, which is in the middle of all these other herd management areas, is a herd area which is not managed for horses. The whole area is categorized as a complex because there is interchange of the horses between the herd management areas, and there's especially a lot of mixing between horses coming from one area to another in the middle in Arapahoe Creek, which is the largest of the areas. I have been visiting and observing and documenting the horses in the Red Desert Complex since 2016. There were roundups in 2018 and 2020 in that area, using helicopters and gathering thousands of horses. And many of the horses and families that I had grown to know and love were removed during this roundup. But I have continued to visit the area and the horses that remain about 5 or 6 times per year. I saw many families that I knew in October, including the stunning leopard Appaloosa stallion named Looking Glass and his family, which includes the newest member, Donata, an adorable buckskin blanket Appaloosa filly, and she has spots on her rear end. They all looked very healthy and in good weight going into the winter. And this year, above all others, they needed that body fat and good condition. I also saw, in November, the black and white pinto Chiron with his large and colorful family, and they were headed into Stewart Creek. I've spent time with he and his family every trip I took out to the desert this last year. He and his mares and youngsters looked healthy and strong and ready for winter. But I wonder if any of the wild horses and other wildlife could have been prepared for what nature threw at them this year. Wild horses know where to go, where to migrate to find forage, to find water. They know the best places to find where the snow gets blown from the ridges and hills to expose forage, the places where the snow may be less deep so they can dig down, and the best places to get out of the wind. They teach their offspring, and the memory guides the next generation. But this winter was like no other in recent times, and the horses who were alive back in the 80s, or who had had that knowledge passed down, have either been removed by roundups in 2011, 2018, 2020, or have passed away. My friend Jim Brown, a wonderful and very experienced wildlife and wild horse photographer, decided to hire a pilot to fly over the Northlander complex, which is another complex that consists of 4 herds near Riverton, Wyoming. He was very concerned about the extreme conditions the horses in those herd management areas were facing this year, and he's been following these herds for over 30 years. When I heard about the proposed flight, I asked if I could go, but it was a 2-seater plane, but we worked it out. Jim went in the morning to Northlander, and I went in the afternoon to the Red Desert, which was only a 30-minute plane ride from the Riverton airport. I had never been in a 2-seater plane before. The smallest I had flown in as a passenger was a 4-seater, and when I saw that instead of sitting side by side with the pilot was going to be sitting in front of me, I was surprised, but determined. Our pilot, Art, who so kindly took us up, is a flight instructor, and he was very willing to help us find horses and spot them. I got into my seat with some scrambling and had my camera on my lap with my long lens, and I was prepared to see as much as possible of the horses in the area. I was concerned about putting stress on the horses who were already under pressure from the elements, so we were not going to fly close to them or put pressure on them so that they would run. We started by flying between Green Mountain and Crooks Mountain, above Crooks Gap Road, a road I'm so familiar with traveling that I swear my car could do it without guidance. The road was completely snow-covered and wind-blown, and all I could see was a faint trace of it on the ground. There was a huge cloud covering the top and east side of Green Mountain, which is over 9,000 feet tall. So we flew around the base and the middle of the mountain, dodging the tendrils of fog and clouds. The views of the mountains covered in snow took my breath away. This was a completely different vantage point than I was used to, and it was a magical sight. Everywhere I looked was white. Soon, as we went, I could pick out groups of black dots near the ridges that the wind had blown free of snow. Many of the dots resolved into horses. Some of them we saw were pintos as we got closer, and most of the horses we passed either continued to stand or paw through the snow and graze as we passed. There was a beautiful pinto mare standing over her pinto yearling. A yearling is a young horse who was born last year, a year old, hence the name yearling, who was lying in the snow with her black stallion next to her. There was turbulence in the small plane from winds coming off the mountain, and as the plane bucked and Art took us higher to escape the worst of it, I struggled to focus my camera on the horses and avoid the struts and propeller as I photographed out the large windows on either side of me. It was very hard to get autofocus on my camera to work as I twisted around trying to get a look at the horses we passed. After going as far as we could around Green Mountain, we turned and went to Crooks Mountain, which is not as tall, and it had no cloud cover. As we passed a huge ridge, I spotted the dots of 2 horse families standing, tiny in the vastness of the mountain. We were able to fly over the top, and I saw no horses up there, but several families midway down the mountain. One family was moving together in a line and came face to face with another family going the opposite direction. When they met, both families stopped. It was too cold for the stallions to argue with each other, as they might in a warmer season. They stood staring at each other. I wondered if they would travel together or finally pass each other. As we left the mountain and flew over Arapahoe Creek, we saw a small, lone, dead horse on top of the snow. Legs stiff, 4 white socks, and a short tail, marking it as about a year old. I was very sad to see the young horse there all alone, and I fervently hoped we would not be seeing more horses who did not make it. The young horses and the oldest horses, both with less reserves of fat, would be the most at risk this winter. We continued traveling south and tried to get into Stewart Creek. We were able to see that Barrow Road, another main access into the area, was completely drifted over with snow and impossible to pass. And then as we approached the ridges, the turbulence became so bad, even at 1,000 feet, shaking hard, that we had to turn around. I was tremendously relieved when the plane evened out in calmer air. I suggested that we head toward Antelope Hills, which has lower ridges, and would make a logical way to move back toward the Riverton Airport. In Antelope Hills, the horses there are the wildest of the wild in the Red Desert Complex, likely because it is the most remote area and they see the least humans. The wind was still blowing fiercely as we progressed, but frequently it would even out enough to get a look at what was below. And what a sight it was. Stretched out in front of me was an ocean of snow, a sea of white, as far as I could see, from Arapahoe Creek through Antelope Hills and beyond a Great Divide Basin in the distance. I could see the mountains far behind that seemed to float above the vast field of snow. There were areas where the snow was so deep that there were deep chasms like in a glacier. There were whirls and patterns from the wind as it teased the snow, and I could see the tops of sagebrush sticking up in some areas. As we flew on, I finally began to see ridges where the snow had blown off, and that was where I began to see horses. There was a gorgeous tricolor pinto standing all by himself, and we saw a line of horses traveling single file where the snow was the least deep, with a buckskin stallion leading 3 black mares, a grilla mare, and 3 pintos. This was the largest group that we saw. One of the most striking things I observed from my aerial vantage point was the marks that the horses left in the snow. The hoof prints, marks from lying down, and digging in the snow clustered together, forming patterns that, from way above, reminded me of sea coral. In some of these areas, the horses had moved on, and in some of them, the horses were still there. There was a gorgeous black and white pinto stallion facing a Palomino pinto mare who was determinedly digging through the snow to get to the grass below. She looked pregnant, with a large belly. Most of the mares I saw did not look pregnant. Because of the harsh conditions, I'm expecting a smaller foal crop this coming spring and summer. Mares can absorb or abort their foals, and supporting the growth of a foal takes a lot of extra energy from the mares. In 2019, which was a harsh winter, but not nearly as bad as this winter, there were far fewer foals born in the spring and summer than normal. In one of the areas with less snow underneath a ridge, I spotted a gorgeous big dappled gray stallion that I thought I recognized as one of the stallions that had been released back into Antelope Hills after the 2020 roundup. The BLM released a small number of stallions and mares back into the herd management areas where they had been captured from after they finished the roundup in those areas, and even crowded into the stock trailer. When I first glimpsed him, he had been a memorable sight. On this day, he moved proudly with his head high and high steps, following a black mare and her black yearling. We saw one more large family with a sorrel stallion, black and white mare, a bay, and an Appaloosa, which was a bay with spots on her rump, and 2 grillas, and a black mare with her black yearling following her. One family that had mostly bays had a mare who got bogged down in a drift as they were walking, and then she easily extricated herself, and the rest of her family changed course to head to snow that was less deep. Near the oil field in Antelope Hills, there were several small families. All had their heads down, digging through the snow and eating. As we came up over a ridge, I saw one long line of horses moving together, and they were so colorful. There were pintos, there were duns, there were grullas, and there were buckskins. And I found it so interesting that the horses had worked out a method of moving in a line, and it made total sense to me because if one of them got into a drift, like the bay mare I talked about earlier, then the others could go around, or if the mare in front had a good path, they would follow that path. This is not how wild horses generally move in the spring and summer, where they can see the ground in front of them, they know the land, and they can move together in a looser group. But in the snow, they moved in lines. The lack of other wildlife was surprising to me. We saw one lone coyote and one group of about 25 beautiful desert elk as we headed out of the area and back toward the airport. I did not see any pronghorn antelope or deer as I usually would in other times of the year. During this flight, I was only able to see a small portion of the Red Desert Complex, and seeing it from above underlined for me how vast this area is and how lucky I am to see the horses that I do see when I visit, and especially that I'm able to see the same horses again and again on different trips. None of the horses I saw looked dangerously thin. That's the good news. The young horses were thinner than the adults, as expected, but I was very pleased to see that the wild horses in this area were finding forage and surviving this very challenging winter, living together. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to see how the wild horses survive in winter. It's very different being up in a plain and being able to see the land around them than it is driving down a road, looking from side to side while I'm driving and trying to catch a glimpse of horses to the side. They are tough and well suited to the high desert lands that they call home. I can only hope that a spring thaw will be coming soon. All this snow will provide water and nurture the growth of the grass and other plant life that all of the animals depend upon, and the cycle of the seasons will continue. I cannot wait until I can drive out into the area and see the horses that I know and love in warmer times. Thank you for listening to this episode 4 of Freedom for Wild Horses. To celebrate the launch of the show, I'm going to be giving away a 12-inch by 18-inch metal print of Blue Zeus called Into the Blue and 2 signed copies of my book, Blue Zeus, Legend of the Red Desert. I'm going to be giving them away to 3 lucky listeners who follow, rate, and review the show. Now, it doesn't have to be a 5-star review, although I sure hope you love the show. I really want your honest feedback so I can create an awesome show that provides tons of value. Visit www.wildhoofbeats.com/podcast launch to learn more about the contest and how to enter. I'll be announcing the winners on the show in episode 10. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.